we're going to move on to our next segment here. Coming back on the show is Sohrab. He's a senior writer for Commentary Magazine. And welcoming him for the first time to the show is Mr. Johan Norberg. He's an author and executive editor at Free Choice Media. And we're going to have a Skype guest also joining us. Do we have Micah? You there, Micah?
Yes, I am.
All right, Micah Uetricht. He's the managing editor at Jacobin magazine. Welcome, Micah, Sohrab, and Johan.
Thank you.
So, Johan, you have a documentary, and it's called Sweden Lessons for America, and let's take a look at your trailer.
It seems like it's like a place that, like, no problems or something.
It is a socialist economy.
Volvos and socialized medicine.
So it seems our international companies are pretty well known, but our economic system is misunderstood. This is the story of how we Swedes grew our nation to become the fourth most prosperous country in the world, and almost threw it all away. We'll explore a little Swedish history and meet some people who will show us what it's really like to live in Sweden today. I think there might be lessons learned for other countries, but I'll leave that for you to think about as I share this story about my home.
So that was really interesting. I feel like your documentary is made for people like me because I constantly meet Swedish people and I constantly read about it. I don't know if you know the book Viking Economics.
Yeah.
And I always say if it weren't so cold, I would have already moved to Sweden. Like, what's the secret? But most importantly, what kind of misconceptions do people have about your country?
There are so many misconceptions about Sweden. That's why I had to make this whole documentary to talk about it. But one of them is this whole story about socialist Sweden. Because socialism in Sweden, that was really a brief interlude in the 1970s and 1980s with incredibly high taxes regulating everything and doubling public spending and things like that. And that's really the moment in time when Sweden began to lag behind other countries, and it ended in a big financial crisis. And it seems when Americans talk about Sweden, their perception has this lag. It's still stuck in the 1970s.
Well, and to that point, I looked up, so Heritage Foundation, which it's conservative. I've just thrown it out there. If you don't know them, they're conservative. But they put out a global ranking every year of, it's an index of economic freedom, and Sweden actually ranks higher than America in economic freedom, according to the Heritage Foundation methodology. Sweden is number 15 and America is number 18 for their most recent index. So I think that that's interesting because it certainly confirms what you're saying as far as the misperceptions about Sweden. But let's bring in our Skype guest. Micah, what's your take on Sweden? And I know that you've written about socialism and that you believe it's getting a renaissance, but what Johan is saying is that Sweden is actually really not that socialist relative to other countries.
Well, Sweden is not a socialist country. What goes on in Sweden in terms of the strong welfare state, strong levels of unionization, the basic level of dignity that Swedish people have that unfortunately Americans lack, are all very good things. They're characteristics of a social democracy. So, Nordic countries, Western European countries that have checks on capitalist power run amok that make life better for people. But I would agree that the country is not a socialist country. And in fact, part of the reason why things have gotten worse in Sweden, of course, I'm not from Sweden. I can't speak to the lived realities like your guest can. But from my perspective, part of the reason why things have gotten so much worse in Sweden is the decades of the last 2-3 decades of attacks on the social welfare state of Sweden that have eroded it and have made room for the right to move in, and with parties pushing xenophobia. Because the welfare state there has been weakened, there's room for people looking for attacks on groups like immigrants in Swedish society. But I don't think that the provisions in Swedish society, strong social welfare state, are the reasons are a bad thing. They're a good thing. They've made life dignified for Swedish people, and it's something that all people around the world could have and should have.
So, Rob, so we've been Obviously, there's been a renaissance, particularly with Bernie Sanders touting Sweden as the perfect economic system and really aspiring to have America adopt some of its policies. How do you feel about that? Do you think that this is possible? Do you think it doesn't take into account the cultural context of America being such a hyper-individualist country? What's your take?
I would. I'm a man of the right, but I would say that right now in the U.S. and across the West, we're seeing a degree of discontent with the liberal status quo. And when I say liberal, I don't mean the center left or the left or anything like that. I mean that
globalist.
Not even a globalist, but a kind of the idea that the free movement of goods, labor, and services and economic freedom is always and everywhere a good. And I think people are increasingly seeking substantive justice, because what liberalism says is, look, we have a set of fair procedures, the norms are fine in terms of economic freedom, and so just let's see what outcomes play out. And I think a lot of people are saying, voters, including voters on the right in the U.S. in 2016 election, are some way saying, no, hold on, there has to be some barriers, because as it is, the system isn't working for us. What I worry about the movement towards socialism among young people on the left, people like our friend via Skype, with a charming Jacobin magazine, is that they have to contend with what went wrong with socialism in the 20th century, with public ownership of nearly all goods. I have command economies. Why we ended up with East Germany? Why did we end up with the Gulag? Why did we end up with, or just stagnant economies where people felt alienated and atomized? And
I don't think the modern day American left is advocating for state ownership of the means of production like Marx or like the socialism of the Soviet Union. It's really more advocating for the systems that Sweden has. No?
Well, I think there was a lot of romance in those same circles for, let's say, Hugo Chávez's Venezuela a few years ago. They don't speak about it. It's been memory hold. But certainly there used to be a romance with Hugo Chávez, and now we're seeing the result of what that means. It's a suffocating system because property is a natural right, and people instinctively seek property rights as one of the things that gives them dignity. And a state that has such immense power over property inevitably has to go against human nature. And when you do that, you need a police state.
Johan, I want to pull in. We have a viewer commenter here. John O'Brien. He says there are big social problems in Sweden due to the immigration, and we know the elections just happened in Sweden, and it appears that the conservative or the right-leaning party has gained substantially, in part, running on a platform about concerns over immigration. I was on CNN the night of the shithole comments allegedly by the president, and
are you allowed to say
I
that
said
on air?
we're on the internet, so it's news. But I said look below the noise, because if you look below the noise, I quoted Milton Friedman, and he said, look, there's a big difference between a country that has open borders with no social welfare state and a country that has a welfare state and closed borders. You pretty much, if you try to have both, you're going to go bankrupt. And so I made the point, let's look at the substance here. 58% of immigrants with children are on welfare, American welfare. This is according to the National Academy of Sciences. So this is a lot of public money. And I got pushback on CNN because people said, well, you're the descendant of immigrants. And I said, yeah, but when my ancestors arrived, there was no social safety net by the government. So this is an apples to oranges comparison. What's the state of welfare for immigrants in Sweden? Is that part of what drove the results here?
Yeah, well, the problem with the welfare state in Sweden was that it was really built as a one-size-fits-all system. And the Social Democrats at the time, in the 1970s, said that, look, we've got all the preconditions. We lead the world when it comes to trust, when it comes to the work ethic, not finding it acceptable to live on public benefits or anything like that. So we can build a welfare state here. The problem is obviously when new generations and new immigrants enter Sweden, the young and the immigrants who do not have the same preconditions and face completely different incentives. they find it more acceptable then to live on public benefits, and it gets a bit more difficult to find those jobs that would help you to sustain. I don't want to exaggerate it too much because, immigrants, their employment level in Sweden is 62%, something like that. And that's actually higher than the average in European Union countries for the natives. But it's 10 percentage points lower than for native Swedes. And if you have a big welfare state, everybody has got to work. And obviously this creates problems when we've had this large influx of refugees, 160,000 in 2015.
So, Johan, Micah, pulling you back in from Skype. So you wrote at your magazine about this question of socialism and how it's seeing a renaissance among younger people in particular. What do you respond to Johan's point about young people and maybe they don't have the same, maybe their parents' generation, they had it harder, so they had to work harder. And so maybe the younger people don't understand simply because they've had an easier life. They don't understand the problems of such an expansive welfare state.
I think the problems that young people have today are the result of the fact that the welfare state has contracted significantly, and because life is actually much more difficult for young people today. We all know the stats about wages that haven't risen, that have effectively remained flat for decades, that people are crushed under student debt, people are crushed under crushing medical bills. There's a whole list of reasons why young people today have it much worse, have a life that is much more difficult than their parents' generation. And I think
we just literally just had the highest median household income ever in 2017, a big bump from 2016.
But we know that real wages, when adjusted for inflation, have not risen. They've stayed flat, and they especially have not been coupled with productivity. Productivity has gone through the roof. American workers are being more productive. They're producing more profit for their bosses than ever, and yet their wages real wages are remaining flat. So it's clear that things are really bad for young people today, and I think that's why they're turning to socialism.
Is this also a product? I mean, at least for me, the way that I see it, I don't know how it is in Sweden, and maybe you'd have input on this as well, but is this not really more of a product of money and politics? It's rather than maybe the reason why Sweden does rank higher in terms of it being a free market is that there's not as much crony capitalism. And that's increasingly what we're seeing in America. So crony capitalism being when, special interests unduly influence policymakers.
Well, toward that end, Kathleen Bellin Plagerman says term limits now. So maybe that's something. Do they have term limits in Sweden?
Oh, they stay forever when they get in.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's something universal we can all agree on. I don't know. Are you in? Are you in for term limits, Micah?
Sure, I believe in term limits.
Awesome. Perfect. Let's end on that note then. Thanks so much for joining us, Micah Uetricht. Hope you come back. Johan Norberg and Sohrab Ahmari. Thanks so much.